Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here in this role today. I enjoy hearing others speak, and after last week, had to tell John, what do you do to follow sweet baby James opening the sermon? Uh, but it is good to be with you. Adrian and I have a tradition that marks a very special time each year for us. I routinely travel abroad each summer to attend a conference or for business of one sort or another. And so she'll choose one of my trips and we'll buy a ticket for her and she goes with me. And then we tack a week's vacation on to the end of my conference. And it's a wonderful way to get to see different parts of the world. In the summer of 2019, we went to Rome. I had a good conference. We had a better week afterwards. When we landed at JFK, both of us had multiple messages on our phones saying, call immediately. And we all know that's not a good sign. So I got a hold of Lee, my stepdaughter, and she said, my uncle Jim, Adrian's brother, has died suddenly in Florida. So I told Adrian, and we, the next week, went to Florida and attended Jim's funeral. We were both in shock. Jim and Mary Jo had just visited us a couple of months previous to this, and he was in great shape. But things can happen. When the funeral was over, I went back to New Haven. Adrian stayed in Florida. Her best friend of lifelong standing, or virtually lifelong standing, had developed a brain tumor. Adrian had gone for her annual, they got together once a year, or did get together once a year. They'd been together in May. Anna was great. But when Adrian had come back a couple weeks later, Anna had a seizure and they found that she had a brain tumor. So Adrian went to spend a week with Anna. She got home and I was getting ready for another one of my trips, this time to Germany, and Anna died. So I changed my arrangements, shortened my stay in Marburg, and arranged to go back to North Carolina to conduct Anna's funeral. When I got back to Yale finally, I ran into a good friend, another dean at the university, whose father had just died. Her father's a person of faith, she is not. And as we exchanged stories, she looked at me and she said, I wish I had your faith. And I've never forgotten that. Does our faith matter? Does what we do here on Sunday mornings, whether remotely or in person, affect our lives? I want to say it does. And I don't want to live my life without that faith. I wouldn't want to have a diagnosis of diabetes without faith. And I wouldn't want to look at members of my own family or very close friends over a casket and have no word beyond they were a good person to say to them. So I'd like to look at a story with you from the Gospel of Luke that I think addresses this. Now, there are three versions of this story in our Gospels. Luke has one, Matthew has one which is very similar but not quite identical, and John has one that's quite different, but it's clear that it's pretty much the same story. So we're going to focus on Luke, but I will mention the other two as a way of highlighting what the version in Luke tells us that's so important. I have four things that I'd like to share with you that strike me about this particular story in Luke. The first one is that Luke has the only version in which the centurion never meets Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, the centurion goes to Jesus and asks Jesus directly. In John's gospel, the royal official goes to Jesus and asks Jesus directly. But in Luke, the centurion sends two delegations. The first one, a group of Jewish elders, perhaps rulers of a synagogue, and the second one, when Jesus is close to his house, his own friends. And the result is he never meets Jesus in the entire story. And I've thought about that a good bit. Why not? Well, in Luke, if we think from the first century just for a minute, it's probably because this centurion is a non-Jew. And Luke doesn't have Jesus go to the Gentiles. He holds that for Acts. So this centurion is one of those whom Isaiah says is far off, which is referred to in Acts chapter 2. And that's probably what's being signified here. But there's something else involved. I don't know how you relate to God, but I have never seen God. I have never heard God, and I know I can't touch God. God is distant. And sometimes in life, God feels more distant than other times. Now, Luke is not the only biblical author to present God as distant. So, for example, the book of Esther, God is never mentioned. And this bothered people so much in the ancient world that they actually created 6 editions to the book of Esther. And if you get a Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, you'll read these editions, and God is mentioned more than 50 times. It's like, how can you have a book in the Bible that doesn't mention God? But there's a reason for that. And that is sometimes God doesn't feel like God is standing beside us. And I confess, when I stood in JFK and talked to Lee, God felt farther away than from JFK to Rome. Sometimes that happens in life. Luke wants us to understand that God isn't necessarily immediately present. And that's what faith is about. It's realizing that and believing in God in spite of it. There's a second thing that strikes me about this story. And that is, this is a piece of art. I couldn't find a piece of art that showed the delegations. Every artist that I could find only wants to show the centurion or the royal official approaching Jesus. So this is based on Matthew's version, not Luke's version. But what does he do? He asks for his servant to be healed. Now, let me explain this just for a minute. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew uses the word servant, but that word can also mean child. In John's Gospel, the evangelist uses the word son, but he also will use the word that we have here for child or servant. But in Luke, it's the servant. He'll use the word child servant once, but he uses the word slave to introduce and to finish the gospel to make it very clear. The centurion is worried about somebody who is well beneath his social status. They're not on a par with one another. Now, you may be thinking, well, he's worried about him because he serves him. How else is he going to eat dinner or whatever this servant might have done for him? But that's not the picture of this centurion in this text. This is somebody who builds a synagogue for the Jews, who cares about other people. I think he genuinely cared about his servant. Faith doesn't focus on oneself. Faith focuses on other people. And that's the point of this story. In At Yale, I've been reading a history of Yale. There's a picture there of Benjamin Silliman, who was a famous professor at Yale in the 19th century, and in fact put science on terra firma at Yale University and had an impact nationally. But Ben Silliman had an assistant by the name of Robert Park, who went with him everywhere and helped conduct experiments. So in 1835, Silliman was invited to give a series of lectures in Boston. Park went with him. And when they were there, Silliman wrote back a letter in which he said, the audience seems to think of Park as a sub-professor, in other words, as an assistant professor. And so when they were coming back on the train, remember the year 1835, Park was seating in second class. Silliman was up in first class. What did he do? He left first class and went back and sat in second class with his assistant, Park. Now, in that age, that was quite remarkable. But we would say there should never have been a distinction between who could sit in first class and who could sit in second class based on race. And I am grateful, I think all of us are, for Martin Luther King, who helped to erase that line so that it would no longer exist. And I hope someday at Yale that Robert Park is given the credit he deserves for his contributions to science in the way that Silliman has been credited with his contributions. That's what we need to do. But it can be something more than just race. When I was serving at church many years ago, I took a youth group at Christmas time over to a facility that was for adolescents struggling with mental illnesses. And they were to sing carols to this group. So we got there and we were in the rooms and we got all situated, and the staff started bringing in these young adults, these young people. And as they were wheeling these people in, I realized that I hadn't found out or explored how serious their challenges were. I was expecting to have a room full of people with Down syndrome, maybe Fragile X, maybe people who'd struggled with mental illnesses as a result of a drug overdose. But the people that were brought into this room were very misshaped. They were distorted physically because of their illnesses. And as we introduced ourselves, the people in this youth group, these young women and men, instinctively walked across the room and hugged every person on the other side of the room. And I'm sure my mouth was pretty wide open as I watched this. I didn't ask them to do that. And as they did it, I thought, I'm not sure your parents would do this, in all honesty. But their love and their faith allowed them to see these people as human beings. And that's how they treated them. This centurion saw his servant, who many people would not have seen as a full human being, as a human being, and cared for him. That's part of what faith is. That's what Martin Luther King understood. There's a third point in this, and this is a prayer attributed to St. Francis, but it's actually a 20th century prayer. It first appeared in 1912 in a French publication. All of you know it, but it represents what it means to think about others, and that's why I include it. The third point is to think about the difference between what the first delegation the centurion sent to Jesus and the second delegation said about the centurion. In the first delegation, the people said, well, he's worthy. He built our synagogue. So that's a picture of the synagogue in Capernaum. That's a 4th century synagogue. There is probably underneath that, there was an earlier synagogue, maybe built in the 1st century. We don't know. It's gone, other than a basalt foundation. But he built a synagogue. Now we know that sometimes non-Jews built synagogues for Jews. We have several inscriptions that attest to this. And this centurion had probably done that. And they said, he's worthy. Look what he's done. But when Jesus got close to his house, the second delegation, which was his friends, quoted the centurion. And what did the centurion say? Twice he said, I am not worthy. There's a line that if you've ever gone to a Catholic Mass, you've heard this because it's said in celebration of the Eucharist, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, which is taken from this text. And he says, I'm not worthy for you to have to come all the way to me. What strikes me about this is that this is a person of humility who doesn't impose or insist on his rights. He didn't come to Jesus and demand, I need to see Jesus and I want to see him myself, and I want him to recognize me for this good that I've done. Think of the synagogue that I built. He doesn't do that. He just sends people to Jesus and says, you shouldn't have to come all the way to my house. I'm not worthy to receive you as a guest. I think about how different that is in terms of our modern world. Now, I will support the right to protest. I'm a good American. I believe in that. But faith is not entitlement. Faith doesn't allow us to come to God and say, God, this is what you owe me. I was many, many years ago a director of graduate studies for a department at another university. This was my first real administrative job. And we had a fellowship that we called a presidential fellowship. And it paid a healthy stipend for 4 years. And then after 4 years, you went on to a regular fellowship. And we announced this when people visited us. I sent letters every year to those who had presidential fellowships, reminding them of this. And so one year, this young man came to see me and he said, I want to protest the fact that next year my stipend is going to go down. And I said, well, okay, on what basis? He said, well, think of what I contribute to this university. And so I said, okay, how many classes have you taught? Well, I haven't taught any yet. How many books have you written? Well, I haven't published any book. How many articles have you published? None. And he says, so you haven't done anything that we require every faculty person here to do, and you're telling me we owe you. Now, in all candor, I'm a little old-fashioned. I wanted to reach across the desk and grab him by the neck and just say, wake up, man. This is way beyond what you're entitled to. We've told you this. He knew it, but he didn't want to accept it. But I think we need to realize that faith is not an entitlement program. What it is the confidence that God, who is far greater than we are, will care for us and will do for us what we need. When my daughters were very young, we used to, this was while I was doing my PhD in Berkeley, we used to go to the Sierra Nevadas and camp right at the end of school. By camp, we stayed in a cabin. That's not really camping, but it was quite nice. But in the evenings, I would take the girls and we would go down to a meadow and just lay in the grass and look at the stars over our heads. And sometimes we would reach our hands up laying in this grass and just say, how far is that star from us? And of course, even to do that seems utterly ridiculous, but it represented the great distance. And all three of us were overwhelmed by the majesty of what we were seeing and had a sense of God's presence in that. This centurion never met Jesus. He never saw Jesus. He never touched Jesus. He never heard Jesus' voice. But he believed in that power beyond and in the goodness of that power. That's what faith is. There's a last thing that may not be too obvious, but it's a point that strikes me as important. In early Christianity, there were a group of people, followers of Jesus, who collected what Jesus said. And about 235 verses of what Jesus said. And these are incorporated now into our Gospel of Matthew and our Gospel of Luke. They're not in Mark and they're not in John. Scholars call this Q for German Quelle. But it's a collection of what Jesus said. There are only two narratives, two stories in this whole collection. Everything else is just what Jesus said. One story is the temptation story. And I think that's there because if you think of Matthew and Luke, Jesus speaks and you get this dialogue. Mark doesn't have that, only Matthew and Luke. The other story is this story, which is in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark. Now, why would someone put this story in with a collection of Jesus' sayings? I think the reason is because they realized that what this story was fundamentally about was the power of Jesus' word. Only say the word. That's all you have to do, Jesus, and my servant will be healed. This centurion believed that Jesus had power in what he said. In the 16th century, the reformers also came to this conclusion. And it's interesting, if you go into churches in Europe, I went into a church and there was a raised podium, but then behind the podium, right back up here, there was a raised pulpit right in the center of the church. And I thought, how interesting. What they are saying is, the center of this service is the proclaimed word. Now, if you go into a Catholic church today, you're liable to see this. In the center is the altar, where the Eucharist is celebrated. And the pulpit is off on a side. That's typical in a Catholic church because the homily doesn't have the central importance that the Eucharist has. But in Protestant churches, where's the pulpit typically? Right here, that's right. And that's not an accident. And in a church like this, we have the pulpit and the table, the altar, right in the center as a way of saying both have centrality. But the fact that this is in the center is symbolically important. It's a way of saying we believe in the power of Jesus' word. And so, if you think about your own life and you wonder, does what I do here on Sundays matter? Does my reading of Scripture matter? Does my faith matter? It mattered to this centurion and it mattered to his servant. And I will say it matters deeply to me personally. I don't want to live my life without that faith. I don't want to face a funeral. I don't want to face an illness. I don't want to face a crisis without that faith. We're entering a year which could be a pretty tough year. At least I'm worried about it. It's because we have so many forces pulling us apart and not enough bringing us together. It's because we have multiple wars that threaten to escalate if somebody makes the wrong decision. You know all the same things that I know. How do we face this? We face it as people of faith. Faith not in ourselves, but faith in God. Not in a God we can touch, in a God who may be distant, but whose word has the power to change our lives. That is what it means to have faith.